The sun was at its peak, turning the pond at Dumbarton Oaks into a sheet of hammered gold. But it was the boy's shoes that stopped Danielle in her tracks. Hand-stitched Italian leather, spotless amidst the mud and clover. He wasn't crying, wasn't calling out. He was simply sitting on a stone bench, clutching a heavy gold chain that looked far too old for a child, and far too valuable to be real. "Are you waiting for someone?" Danielle asked, her voice barely a whisper above the buzzing dragonflies. The boy didn't look up, but he shifted just enough for her to see the crest on the signet ring hanging from his neck, a dragon entwined with a phoenix, an emblem of a world Danielle only knew from history books and high-stakes news cycles. The air in the Washington, D.C. Botanical Garden smelled of damp earth and expensive blooming jasmine. It was the kind of heat that made everything move in slow motion, yet Danielle felt a sudden, sharp prick of adrenaline. As a freelance researcher, she was trained to notice the details others missed, the way the boy's silk shirt was buttoned to the very top despite the humidity, and the way his small, dark eyes scanned the tree line not with fear, but with a haunting, practiced patience. "I'm Danielle," she said, crouching so she was eye level with him. "My name is Minjun," he replied, his voice small but perfectly composed, accented with a hint of something melodic and soul-born. He didn't reach for her hand, but he didn't pull away when she sat beside him on the sun-warmed stone. For an hour, they sat in a strange, shared bubble of quiet. Danielle didn't call the police immediately. Something about the boy's stillness suggested that authority was exactly what he was hiding from. He began to tell her, in fragments, about a big house with too many locks, and a brother who painted his skin so the shadows wouldn't catch him. Danielle felt a chill that had nothing to do with the shade of the willow trees. She realized then that this wasn't just a lost child. This was a message left in the open for someone to find, and she was the only one who had stopped to read it. "Hey there, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please shout out your location in the comments. While you're at it, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Let's dive straight into the heart of today's video." The sun at Dumbarton Oaks was relentless. A thick, golden, syrupy heat that made the manicured hedges of the North Garden shimmer like a mirage. Danielle adjusted her glasses, the bridge of her nose slick with perspiration, as she wandered away from the main tourist path. She had come here to find quiet, to escape the digital hum of her research projects, but what she found instead was a rupture in the scenery. He was sitting perfectly upright on a weathered stone bench near the koi pond. A small boy, perhaps no older than 5, dressed in a charcoal-colored silk suit that looked far too heavy for a July afternoon in D.C. His hair was parted with surgical precision, and his hands, small, pale, and remarkably still, were folded over a velvet pouch in his lap. Danielle paused, her shadow stretching across the gravel path until it touched his polished Italian loafers. "Hey there," she said, her voice dropping into the soft, melodic register she used when she didn't want to startle the wildlife. "Are you here with your school? Or maybe your parents are just around the corner?" The boy didn't flinch. He slowly turned his head, his dark, almond-shaped eyes holding a depth of exhaustion that no child should possess. "I am waiting for the shift to change," he said. His English was formal, clipped, carries the ghost of a soul accent. He didn't look lost. He looked like he was fulfilling a duty. Danielle felt a strange tug in her chest, a mixture of professional curiosity and a deep maternal alarm. She scanned the gardens. The tourists were far off, their laughter muffled by the heavy boxwood hedges. There were no frantic parents, no park rangers, only the rhythmic thrum of the cicadas. "I'm Danielle," she said, carefully taking a seat on the far end of the bench, leaving a respectful gap between them. "I was just about to have a snack. Would you like half of a shortbread cookie?" She pulled a small tin from her bag, the scent of butter and vanilla drifting into the humid air. Minjun looked at the cookie, then at Danielle, then back at the tree line. "Kaylin says I should not take things from strangers, but you have kind eyes, and the sun is very loud today." He took the cookie with a slight bow of his head, a gesture so refined it felt like a relic from a different century. As he ate, the velvet pouch in his lap shifted, and a heavy gold chain slid out, pooling onto the stone like liquid sunlight. Hanging from the end was a massive signet ring, the gold worn smooth by generations of thumbs. It bore a crest Danielle recognized from her studies on East Asian maritime dynasties, a dragon and a phoenix locked in a circle. "It's a very heavy secret to carry, Minjun," she whispered. He looked at the ring, then tucked it back into the pouch with a frantic, trembling hand. "It is not a secret. It is a weight," he replied, his composure finally beginning to crack. "And Kalen is late. He is never late unless the shadows are moving." Danielle felt the hair on her arms stand up. The garden suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a stage, and she realized she was no longer just a bystander. The transition from silence to motion happened in a heartbeat. The sound of gravel crunching under tires shouldn't have been audible from this deep in the garden, yet the air seemed to vibrate with the approach of something heavy. Danielle stood up, instinctively stepping in front of Minjun as a fleet of 3 silver sedans glided to a halt at the edge of the restricted service road. The doors didn't slam, they clicked shut with the precision of a vault. 4 men in understated black suits stepped out, but they didn't move toward the bench. They formed a perimeter, their eyes hidden behind dark lenses, scanning the trees with a predatory focus. Then, the rear door of the center vehicle opened, and a young man stepped out into the blinding light. He couldn't have been more than 25, but he carried himself with the weary authority of an ancient king. His suit was a midnight blue wool, tailored so sharply it looked like armor. But it was his skin that caught the light. A vine of dark, intricate ink crawled up the side of his neck, disappearing behind his ear, while another set of geometric patterns peeked out from beneath his pristine white cuffs. This was Kalen. He didn't run. He walked with a slow, measured stride, his gaze locked entirely on Minjun. When he reached the bench, he ignored Danielle completely at first, dropping to one knee before his brother. "You broke the perimeter, Minjun," Kalen said, his voice a low, resonant cello hum. "I told you to stay within sight of the fountain." "The fountain was too loud, Kalen," the boy whispered. "The lady gave me a cookie. She has kind eyes." Only then did Kalen look up at Danielle. His eyes were a startling, piercing brown, rimmed with a coldness that felt like a physical barrier. He stood up, towering over her, the scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco clinging to him. "I don't know who you are," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "or what you think you saw here, but your involvement ends at this bench." Danielle didn't flinch. She had spent years navigating academic boardrooms and icy archives. She wasn't easily intimidated by expensive suits. "My involvement ends when I'm sure this boy is safe," she replied, her voice steady. "You arrived with a private army, not a hug. In my world, that's a red flag, not a family reunion." A flicker of something, was it amusement, or perhaps a rare moment of surprise, crossed Kalen's face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a hand-pressed business card, gold-embossed and heavy. "I am Kalen Kang, CEO of Aegis Global," he said, his thumb brushing against a tattoo on his wrist. "And this is my brother. I don't expect you to understand the security required for a child of his standing, but I do expect you to step aside." "He's not a standing, Mr. Kang. He's a tired little boy who is hiding from shadows," Danielle countered, refusing to take the card. Kalen's jaw tightened, the ink on his neck shifting as his pulse quickened. For a moment, the two of them stood locked in a silent battle of wills, the scholar and the mogul, while Minjun watched them both, the golden ring still clutched in his small, trembling fist. "You have courage," Kalen finally said, a dangerous softness in his tone. But courage without context is just a hazard. The week following the encounter in the park was draped in an unnatural, heavy silence. Danielle tried to return to her research on antebellum trade routes, but the image of the small boy and the tattooed man haunted the margins of her notes. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the gold signet ring and the way Kalen's ink seemed to pulse against his throat when he spoke. She lived in a modest apartment in Ledroit Park, a place of exposed brick and overflowing bookshelves, a world away from the silver sedans and silent security details of the Kang dynasty. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the silence was broken. There was no knock, only the sliding of a heavy, cream-colored envelope beneath her door. It was thick, hand-pressed paper, sealed with black wax bearing the same dragon and phoenix crest she had seen on Minjun's ring. Inside, there was no letter, only a card with an address in the rolling hills of Middleburg, Virginia, and a single sentence written in precise, elegant calligraphy. "He has not spoken a word since the garden. He asks for the lady with the kind eyes." The drive to Middleburg took her past white picket fences and sprawling equestrian estates, but the Kang residence was different. It was a fortress of glass, cedar, and dark steel tucked behind a forest of ancient oaks. As Danielle pulled her aging sedan up the winding driveway, she felt the weight of 1,000 invisible eyes. Cameras tracked her movement, and two men in suits, different from the ones in the park but possessing the same hollow gaze, motioned for her to park near a cascading stone waterfall. Kaylin was waiting for her on the expansive rear terrace, overlooking a valley that looked like a Renaissance painting. He had traded his suit for a black cashmere sweater, the sleeves pushed up to reveal the full extent of the tattoos on his forearms, intricate depictions of stormy seas and mountain peaks. He looked younger in the natural light, yet infinitely more tired. "You came," he said, his voice barely audible over the rush of the waterfall. "I wasn't sure you would. Most people in this city know better than to walk into a house they don't understand." "I'm not most people, Mr. Kang," Danielle replied, clutching her bag. "And I didn't come for the house. I came because a child is hurting. Why hasn't he spoken?" Kaylin turned away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "In my world, silence is a defense mechanism, but for Min Jun it has become a prison. He sits in the library, staring at the door, waiting for someone who doesn't belong to this family, someone who saw him as a boy, not a key." He looked back at her, and for the first time the ice in his eyes had melted into something resembling a plea. "Please, just sit with him. I will pay whatever your hourly rate for research is." "I don't want your money, Kaylin," Danielle said firmly. "I want to know why a 5-year-old feels the need to build a prison out of silence." The library of the Kang estate was a cathedral of knowledge. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of dark mahogany held leather-bound volumes in Korean, English, and French. The air was cool and smelled of old paper and beeswax. Min Jun was there, sitting in a chair that was far too large for him, staring out a window that looked into a private Zen garden. He didn't turn when Danielle entered, but his small shoulders dropped an inch, a silent sigh of relief. "I brought more cookies," Danielle whispered, settling into the chair beside him. "And I brought a book of my own. It's about the stars. Did you know that the stars we see here are the same ones people saw thousands of years ago in Seoul?" Min Jun remained silent, but his hand reached out, his small fingers brushing the cover of her book. Danielle began to read, her voice steady and rhythmic, filling the cavernous room with stories of constellations and ancient navigators. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Kaylin standing in the shadows of the doorway, watching them. He was a ghost in his own home, a man who provided everything but could not provide the one thing his brother needed, a sense of ordinary safety. As the hours passed, Danielle began to notice the cracks in the perfection of the room. There were hidden panels in the walls, discreet security keypads, and a faint electronic hum that suggested the entire room was swept for listening devices. This wasn't just a home, it was a high-frequency hub of a global empire. "He thinks I am the dragon," Kaylin said later, joining her in the hallway after Min Jun had finally drifted into a fitful sleep. "The tattoos! They represent the Jaipa, the lineage of the protector. I am the one who must be stained so he can remain clean. But he sees the ink and he sees a monster." "He doesn't see a monster, Kaylin," Danielle said, looking at the intricate designs on his neck. "He sees a man who is hiding himself. You've built walls of glass and steel to protect him, but you've accidentally locked yourself out. Why was he really in the park that day? He told me he was hiding from shadows." Kaylin's expression darkened, his hand instinctively going to the signet ring he now wore on his pinky finger. "There is a fracture in the foundation of Aegis Global," he admitted, his voice a low hiss. "My father's sister, my Aunt Sarah, she believes a man with ink on his soul shouldn't lead the family. She wants Min Jun. She wants to raise him to be a puppet, a clean-cut face for a dirty business. Min Jun heard us arguing. He took the ring and he ran. He thought if he gave the ring to a stranger, the shadows would stop following him." Danielle felt a surge of cold clarity. The boy wasn't lost. He was attempting a grand renunciation. He was trying to give away his inheritance to save his brother. "He loves you," Danielle realized, her voice softening. "He wasn't running from you. He was running for you." The Virginia morning broke through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the estate's atrium, but the light felt clinical, stripped of the warmth Danielle had felt in the public park. She sat at a heavy obsidian table, watching Kaylin trace the lines of a digital map projected onto the surface. The tattoos on his hands, dark, swirling ink that resembled the very koi she had seen in the pond, moved with every gesture. He looked like a man trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces were made of smoke. "You're a researcher, Danielle," Kalen said, his voice gravelly from lack of sleep. "Tell me, in your history books, how does a dynasty survive when the rot starts from the inside?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold signet ring. It caught the morning light, casting a distorted shadow of a dragon against the dark table. "This isn't just jewelry, it's a biometric key. It opens the vaults in Zurich, the servers in Singapore, and the legacy of 3 generations of the Kang family." Danielle leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the ring. "Usually, they survive by letting go of the things that weigh them down," she replied softly. "But you're holding onto it so tightly your knuckles are white." She realized then that the physical weight of the ring was nothing compared to the emotional burden Kalen carried. He was acting as a shield for a brother who didn't want a kingdom. He wanted a sibling. Minjun appeared at the top of the glass staircase, clutching a stuffed rabbit that looked jarringly ordinary against the high-tech surroundings. He didn't come down. He simply watched them, his eyes darting to the ring. "It's heavy, isn't it, Danielle?" he called out, his voice finally returning, though it was thin and fragile. "Kalen's skin is heavy too. I tried to give it away so he could be light again." The silence that followed was deafening. Kalen dropped his head into his hands, the ink on his neck darkening as his blood pressure rose. "He thinks the tattoos are the stains of the business," Kalen whispered to her, his voice breaking. "He doesn't know they are the names of the men who protected our father. They are a map of our survival." Danielle stood up and walked to the stairs, reaching out a hand to Minjun. "Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do with a key is to lock the door and walk away for a while," she said, looking back at Kalen. "Your Aunt Sarah is counting on your guilt. She's using your brother's love for you as a weapon. She knows you'll destroy yourself trying to be clean for him." The revelation hit Kalen like a physical blow. He had been so focused on being a boss and a protector that he had forgotten how to be a person. The mystery of Minjun's disappearance in the park was finally solved. It wasn't a kidnapping attempt by an enemy, but a desperate act of sacrifice by a child who loved his brother more than his inheritance. "We're going outside," Danielle announced 2 hours later, ignoring the protests of the 2 security men stationed by the terrace. She had convinced Kalen to shed his midnight blue blazer. For the first time, he stood in a simple gray t-shirt, his arms fully exposed, a tapestry of black ink that told the story of a life lived in the shadows. They walked to a neglected corner of the estate, far from the polished Zen gardens. Here, the soil was raw and the weeds were tall. Danielle had found a box of gardening tools in the shed, and she handed a small trowel to Minjun. "We're going to plant something that doesn't belong to a dynasty," she said. "Just tomatoes, and maybe some basil, things that grow because you care for them, not because you own them." For the first hour, they worked in a strange, peaceful rhythm. Kalen's movements were hesitant at first. His hands were used to signing contracts and wielding influence, not digging in the dirt. But as the sun warmed his back, the tension in his shoulders began to dissipate. He looked less like a mafia boss and more like the young man he was meant to be. "My aunt is coming this evening," Kalen said, his voice steady as he patted the soil around a seedling. "She's bringing the board members. She intends to show them that Minjun is traumatized and that I am unstable because of my aesthetic choices. She wants to invoke the succession clause of 1954. Danielle paused, wiping a streak of dirt from her forehead. "Then let her come. But she won't find a traumatized boy or an unstable man. She'll find a family. You've spent so much time hiding the dirt of your life, Kalen, but you forgot that things only grow when you're willing to get your hands dirty." Minjun laughed, a genuine, high-pitched sound that seemed to startle the birds in the oaks. He had a smudge of mud on his nose, and his silk trousers were ruined, but his eyes were bright. "Look, Kalen, I'm stained too," he shouted, holding up his muddy hands. Kalen froze, looking at his brother's joy. The shadows Minjun had been running from weren't the tattoos or the business. They were the secrets. By bringing Danielle into their world, the boy hadn't just found a friend. He had found a witness. Someone whose grounded, Afro-American perspective cut through the stifling traditions of the Kang legacy. You aren't just a researcher, are you? Kaylin asked, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I'm a truth seeker, Danielle replied. And the truth is, you've already won. She can take the company, but she can't take this. She gestured to the messy, beautiful garden they had started. The mystery was no longer about why the boy was lost. It was about how they were all finally being found. The evening air in the Virginia highlands turned crisp. The sky bruised with shades of violet and deep indigo. The Kang estate was no longer a sanctuary. It had been transformed into a cold, corporate theater. In the grand dining hall, a room of minimalist marble and floating glass, the elders of Aegis Global sat like statues. At the head of the table was Aunt Sarah, a woman whose elegance was as sharp as a razor's edge, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull the very expression from her face. She didn't look like a villain, she looked like a preservationist. Kaylin, she began, her voice a calm, terrifying ripple in the silence. The boy was found in a public park, unprotected, untraceable. Your father's legacy is not a playground for your artistic rebellions or your inability to manage a child's safety. She looked at the board members, her eyes flickering with the triumph of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. The succession clause is clear. A leader who cannot secure his own blood cannot secure our assets. Kaylin stood at the opposite end of the table. He wasn't wearing the midnight blue armor of his suit today. He wore a simple, dark sweater, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing the intricate, dark ink that Sora loathed. Beside him sat Danielle, her posture regal, her eyes calm. She was the outsider, the one variable Sora hadn't accounted for in her calculated takeover. The boy wasn't lost, Sora, Kaylin said, his voice dropping into that resonant, low register that commanded the room. He was protesting. He was trying to give away a ring that had become too heavy because of the fear you instilled in him. Sora scoffed, a dry, hollow sound. And we are to take the word of a researcher, someone with no ties to our history. Danielle stood up then, placing a thick folder on the marble table. Actually, as a researcher, I specialize in the untraceable, she said, her voice steady and echoing through the hall. While you were focused on Minjun's location, I was looking into the shadows he mentioned. I traced the security breach that allowed a 5-year-old to slip out of a high-security estate. It wasn't a failure of Kaylin's guard. It was an intentional, blind spot created by your personal staff, Sora. You didn't want him found quickly. You wanted him found by the press. The room went cold. The board members shifted, their eyes turning toward Sora. Danielle continued. Minjun didn't speak because he was traumatized by his brother. He didn't speak because he heard you telling him that Kaylin's tattoos were the marks of a dying animal. Kaylin stepped forward, placing his hand, ink and all, on the table. I am keeping the company, Sora, and I am keeping my brother. But more importantly, I am keeping the truth. You wanted a clean-cut leader. Look at my hands. They are stained with the work of keeping this family alive. And as of tonight, you are no longer a part of that work. The victory wasn't loud. It was the sound of a heavy door finally closing. Sora realized, too late, that the kind-eyed lady from the park wasn't just a witness. She was the architect of the truth. A year had passed since the afternoon the sun hit the koi pond just right. The Dumbarton Oaks gardens were in full bloom again, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the distant hum of the city. Danielle sat on the same stone bench, a book resting in her lap, but she wasn't alone. Minjun was a few yards away, wearing a bright yellow t-shirt and jeans that were already stained with grass. He was laughing, chasing a butterfly with a clumsiness that was beautiful because it was so normal. He was no longer the porcelain prince. He was just a boy. Kaylin walked up the path, his stride relaxed, his face lacking the weary shadows that had once defined him. He sat down beside Danielle, the gap between them much smaller than it had been a year ago. He didn't look like a man hiding from his own skin anymore. The board approved the new foundation, Kaylin said, looking out at his brother. We're calling it the Open Gate. No more locks. No more secret vaults. We're investing in the communities that the business used to overlook. He looked at Danielle, his expression one of profound gratitude. You were right. The weight of the ring was only heavy because we were carrying it alone. And now? Danielle asked, tilting her head. Now, Kaylin replied, a genuine smile breaking across his face as he watched Minjun trip and scramble back up, unfazed. Now we just let things grow. They sat together in the warm Virginia sun, an Afro-Korean family bound not by blood or corporate mandates, but by the quiet, revolutionary act of being seen. The mystery was over, and in its place, a legacy of light had finally begun to take root.